In the early months of 1945, the Pacific Ocean was a vast, blood-stained chessboard. The United States had fought its way across thousands of miles of salt water and coral, but the ultimate prize, the Japanese home islands, remained tantalizingly out of reach. To the pilots of the massive B-29 superfortresses flying from the Marianas, the distance to Tokyo was a perilous gauntlet. If a plane was damaged, there was nowhere to land but the unforgiving sea. Standing directly in the path of the American advance was a small, ugly speck of volcanic rock, Iwo Jima. It was a fortress of sulfur and ash, a place where the Japanese had spent years preparing for a final stand. For the Americans, it was a necessary stepping stone. For the Japanese, it was a piece of their sacred homeland that could never be surrendered. The collision between these two unstoppable forces would result in the most intense combat in the history of the United States Marine Corps.
Iwo Jima was never meant to be a paradise. Formed by volcanic activity, the island was a wasteland of jagged rocks, steaming sulfur vents, and deep, shifting black ash. To the Marines who peered at it through binoculars from the decks of transport ships, it looked like a prehistoric monster rising from the sea. The smell of rotten eggs, sulfur hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder that they were entering a literal hell on Earth. The strategic importance of this 5-mile-long island could not be overstated. It sat roughly halfway between the American bases in the Mariana Islands and the Japanese capital of Tokyo. It housed 2 vital airfields, with a third under construction. From here, Japanese fighter planes rose to intercept American bombers, and radar stations gave Tokyo early warnings of incoming raids. For the United States Army Air Forces, Iwo Jima was the lifeboat they desperately needed. If the island could be captured, crippled B-29s could land there instead of ditching in the ocean. It would also provide a base for P-51 Mustang escorts to protect the bombers all the way to their targets. The Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that the cost of taking the island, however high, was a price they had to pay. On the other side, the Japanese viewed Iwo Jima as the front door to their house. It was legally a part of the Tokyo Prefecture, meaning for the first time in the war, American boots would be stepping on home island soil. The defense of this rock was not just a military necessity, it was a matter of national honor. Every day the Americans were delayed on Iwo Jima was a day Tokyo had to prepare for the inevitable invasion. As the American Armada, the largest ever assembled in the Pacific, closed in, the island appeared dead. The naval bombardment had been relentless, turning the surface into a cratered moonscape. But beneath the ash and the steam, an invisible army was waiting. The Marines believed the 3 days of shelling had cleared the way, but they were about to discover that the real battle hadn't even begun.
General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was not a typical Japanese commander. He had lived in the United States as a military attaché. He admired American industrial might, and he knew that a traditional banzai charge at the water's edge would be suicide. Instead of wasting his men in a futile attempt to stop the landing, he decided to turn the entire island into a subterranean hive. Under his direction, the Japanese garrison of 21,000 men transformed Iwo Jima into a spider's web. They dug over 11 miles of tunnels, some as deep as 30 feet underground. These weren't just simple trenches, they were sophisticated complexes with electricity, ventilation, hospitals, and command centers. Every bunker was connected to another, allowing troops to disappear from one hole and reappear behind American lines. Kuribayashi's strategy was one of pure attrition. He forbade his officers from leading suicidal charges, ordering them instead to stay in their holes and kill as many Americans as possible. He knew he could not win the battle, but he hoped to make the cost of victory so high that the American public would lose the will to continue the war. Each man, he wrote in his final orders, must kill 10 of the enemy before he dies. The island's centerpiece was Mount Suribachi, a 554-foot dormant volcano at the southern tip. Kuribayashi turned the mountain into a 7-story fortress. Inside, heavy artillery and machine guns were hidden behind steel doors that would slide open, fire, and then vanish before American planes could retaliate. From the heights of Suribachi, the Japanese could see every inch of the landing beaches. By the time the Americans arrived, the surface of Iwo Jima was a deception. The bunkers were camouflaged with volcanic sand, and the artillery was tucked into caves that were invisible from the air. The Marines were about to walk into a trap that had been meticulously set for over a year. Kuribayashi sat in his deep command post, silent and waiting, as the first American landing craft hit the shore.
On the morning of February 19, 1945, the first wave of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. The sun was rising, and for a few moments the scene was eerily quiet. The Marines jumped from their Higgins boats and prepared to rush inland, but they were immediately betrayed by the ground itself. The sand was actually soft, aerated volcanic ash. Men sank to their calves, and heavy packs made every step an agonizing struggle. As the Marines struggled to find footing, the beach became a chaotic logjam of men, tanks, and supplies. Tanks bogged down in the ash, their treads spinning uselessly. Amtraks, amphibious tractors, couldn't climb the steep terraces that rose up from the shore. For nearly 20 minutes, the Japanese held their fire, letting the beaches fill up with thousands of men and tons of equipment until there was no room to move. Then General Kuribayashi gave the signal. From the heights of Mount Suribachi and the ridges to the north, a hellish symphony of mortars, machine guns, and heavy artillery erupted. The Marines were caught in a crossfire that turned the black sand red. There was no cover. The only way to survive was to dig into the ash, but the sides of the holes would simply cave in, burying men alive, while the shells screamed overhead. The carnage was unimaginable. Bodies were torn apart by large-caliber shells, and the screams of the wounded were drowned out by the thunder of the Japanese guns. Navy corpsmen worked frantically under fire, dragging men behind the few tanks that had managed to crawl onto the shore. It was a slaughterhouse. One veteran later recalled that the beach looked like a shattered junkyard of human flesh and steel. Despite the devastating fire, the Marines did what they were trained to do. They moved forward. "Get off the beach!" NCOs screamed over the din. Small groups of men, led by anyone still standing, began to crawl up the terraces. They used explosives to blast through the first line of bunkers, beginning the slow, bloody process of carving out a beachhead. By the end of the first day, 2,400 Americans were dead or wounded, and the island of death had only just begun to take its toll. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the first wave of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. The sun was rising, and for a few moments the scene was eerily quiet. The Marines jumped from their Higgins boats and prepared to rush inland, but they were immediately betrayed by the ground itself. The sand was actually soft, aerated volcanic ash. Men sank to their calves, and heavy packs made every step an agonizing struggle. As the Marines struggled to find footing, the beach became a chaotic logjam of men, tanks, and supplies. Tanks bogged down in the ash, their treads spinning uselessly. Amtraks, amphibious tractors, couldn't climb the steep terraces that rose up from the shore. For nearly 20 minutes, the Japanese held their fire, letting the beaches fill up with thousands of men and tons of equipment until there was no room to move.
Then General Kuribayashi gave the signal. From the heights of Mount Suribachi and the ridges to the north, a hellish symphony of mortars, machine guns, and heavy artillery erupted. The Marines were caught in a crossfire that turned the black sand red. There was no cover. The only way to survive was to dig into the ash, but the sides of the holes would simply cave in, burying men alive, while the shells screamed overhead. The carnage was unimaginable. Bodies were torn apart by large-caliber shells, and the screams of the wounded were drowned out by the thunder of the Japanese guns. Navy corpsmen worked frantically under fire, dragging men behind the few tanks that had managed to crawl onto the shore. It was a slaughterhouse. One veteran later recalled that the beach looked like a shattered junkyard of human flesh and steel. Despite the devastating fire, the Marines did what they were trained to do. They moved forward. "Get off the beach!" NCOs screamed over the din. Small groups of men, led by anyone still standing, began to crawl up the terraces. They used explosives to blast through the first line of bunkers, beginning the slow, bloody process of carving out a beachhead. By the end of the first day, 2,400 Americans were dead or wounded, and the island of death had only just begun to take its toll.
Among the chaos of D-Day was a man who already carried the weight of a legend. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, affectionately known as Manila John, had already earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal. He could have stayed home in New Jersey, selling war bonds and enjoying his hero status, but he couldn't stand being away from his boys. He had requested to return to the front, telling his family, "I'm a plain soldier and I want to stay one." On Iwo Jima, Basilone's leadership was the glue that held his panicked unit together. When his group was pinned down by a Japanese blockhouse near Red Beach, Basilone didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his machine gun and sprinted across the open, fire-swept sand. With total disregard for his own safety, he flanked the position and destroyed it with grenades and demolition charges, single-handedly clearing the way for his platoon. Later that morning, he moved toward Airfield No. 1, helping a bogged-down tank navigate through a minefield under heavy fire. He was a beacon of calm in the middle of a hurricane. His presence alone gave the younger, terrified Marines the courage to keep moving. He was the embodiment of the Marine Corps spirit, indestructible and defiant. But Iwo Jima did not care about legends. While Basilone was rallying his men for another push, a Japanese mortar shell landed in the middle of his group. The blast was fatal. Manila John fell on the black sand he had fought so hard to conquer. He was 28 years old. News of his death would eventually ripple through the ranks, leaving a somber shadow over the men who looked up to him. Basilone's sacrifice became a rallying point. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, making him the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His story reminded every man on the island that no one was safe, but also that one man's courage could change the course of a battle. They would keep fighting, if only to honor the man who chose to leave a comfortable life to die alongside them in the sulfur. By the fourth day of the battle, the Marines had managed to cut the island in half, isolating Mount Suribachi from the rest of the Japanese forces. The volcano was the all-seeing eye of the enemy, and it had to be taken. The climb was a vertical nightmare. Marines had to scale near perpendicular cliffs while the Japanese rolled grenades down on them and fired from hidden crevices. Armed with flamethrowers and satchel charges, the 28th Marines began the corkscrew and blowtorch method. They would burn the entrance of a cave and then toss in explosives to seal it forever. It was grim, claustrophobic work. On February 23rd, a 40-man patrol led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier finally scrambled to the summit. Finding a length of iron pipe, they lashed a small American flag to it and hoisted it into the air. The sight of the stars and stripes atop the volcano triggered an incredible reaction.
Down on the beaches and out on the ships, thousands of men began to cheer. Ships blew their whistles, and some Marines wept openly. For a brief moment, the terror of the last few days was replaced by a sense of triumph. However, the flag was too small to be seen clearly by everyone on the island. A few hours later, a second, larger flag was sent up the mountain to replace the first. As 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman struggled to plant the heavy pipe in the rocky ground, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped a single frame. He didn't know it then, but he had just captured the most iconic image in American military history. The photo perfectly captured the collective struggle, 6 men working together to raise a symbol of hope over a landscape of despair. While the photo became a sensation back in the United States, for the men on Iwo Jima, the battle was far from over. Taking the mountain was a milestone, but the toughest part of the island lay to the north. As the flags fluttered in the wind above Suribachi, the Marines turned their eyes toward the meat grinder, where the bulk of Kuribayashi's army was still waiting in the dark.
With Suribachi secured, the Marines turned their attention to the northern half of the island. If the south was a struggle against geography, the north was a struggle against a fortress. The terrain turned into a jagged moonscape of ridges, gorges, and limestone pinnacles. The Americans gave these places names that reflected their brutality: Hill 382, the Amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. Together, they became known as the Meat Grinder. In the Meat Grinder, the Japanese defense reached its peak of efficiency. The Japanese had carved out honeycombs of positions that supported one another. If the Marines attacked one ridge, they were hit from crossfire from 2 others. Tanks were useless in the narrow, rocky ravines, and the infantry had to fight for every yard with bayonets, grenades, and their bare hands. The casualties in this sector were astronomical. Some companies were reduced from 250 men to fewer than 20 in just a few days. The mental strain was as heavy as the physical toll. Men lived in a constant state of high alert, surrounded by the smell of rotting bodies that couldn't be buried and the persistent, choking dust of pulverized rock. Sleep was impossible, and sanity was a fragile commodity. General Kuribayashi's spider holes were everywhere. A squad of Marines would move past a seemingly empty rock, only for a Japanese soldier to pop up from a hidden hole and fire into their backs. This ghost war meant that no area was ever truly cleared. The Marines had to check every shadow and every crack in the earth, knowing that death could come from any direction at any moment. Day after day, the Marines threw themselves against the northern ridges. They used millions of gallons of napalm and thousands of tons of explosives. It was a war of extinction. The Japanese refused to surrender, and the Marines, hardened by the loss of their friends, stopped offering the chance. The meat grinder was slowly consuming 2 armies, grinding them down into the sulfurous dust of the island. Living on Iwo Jima was like living in a haunted house where the ghosts could kill you. Because of the extensive tunnel system, the Japanese were effectively invisible. Marines would spend an entire day fighting to take a pillbox, losing half their men in the process, only to wake up the next morning and find the same pillbox reoccupied by the enemy, who had crawled back in through a tunnel during the night. The nights were the most terrifying. To save ammunition, Kuribayashi ordered his men to conduct small-scale night raids. They were masters of stealth, moving through the darkness without a sound. They would crawl into American foxholes and use knives or bonsai swords to kill Marines in their sleep. The Americans learned to stay in pairs, one man sleeping for an hour while the other stared into the blackness, finger on the trigger. The heat was another enemy. In many of the tunnels, the volcanic activity made the air temperature rise to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Japanese soldiers lived in these sweltering, oxygen-deprived holes for weeks, their skin turning a sickly yellow from the sulfur and lack of sunlight. The Americans, too, felt the heat radiating from the ground. If you dug a foxhole too deep, it became too hot to sit in. The psychological toll led to Iwo Jima stare, a blanked, hollow expression in the eyes of men who had seen too much. The constant threat of an invisible enemy, the inability to ever truly rest, and the sheer randomness of the mortar fire created an atmosphere of pure dread. Every Marine knew that his survival was less a matter of skill and more a matter of sheer dumb luck. Despite the horror, the Marines developed a grim bond. They shared their water, their K-rations, and their cigarettes. They became a tribe of survivors, bound together by the black sand. They stopped talking about the future or home. They only focused on the next 10 yards, the next cave, and the next sunrise. The Ghost War was stripping them down to their most basic survival instincts.
On March 4, the purpose of all this blood and misery was suddenly validated. As the battle for the northern ridges raged, a giant silver shape appeared in the sky. It was Dynamite, a B-29 superfortress that had been damaged over Tokyo. It was low on fuel and had a malfunctioning fuel valve. Without Iwo Jima, the crew would have been forced to ditch in the freezing Pacific, where their chances of survival were slim. As the massive plane touched down on Airfield No. 1, Marines stopped what they were doing to watch. The plane landed while Japanese shells were still falling on the edges of the runway. The pilots climbed out, kissed the ground, and thanked the Marines. For the weary infantrymen, seeing the faces of the airmen they had saved was a powerful reminder that their sacrifice had a tangible meaning. From that day on, Iwo Jima became a sanctuary. As the airfields were repaired and expanded, more and more B-29s began to circle the island. By the end of the war, 2,251 of the giant bombers would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima. With 11 crew members per plane, that meant over 24,000 American airmen were saved by the ground the Marines were currently dying to hold. The presence of the B-29s also changed the tactical nature of the war. Soon, P-51 Mustangs were stationed on the island, providing a little friend escort for the big friends. This crippled the Japanese air defense and allowed the Americans to hammer the home islands with impunity. The Marines could see the results of their work every time a squadron of Mustangs roared off the runways to head north. However, the sight of the planes was bittersweet. Every time a bomber landed safely, the Marines knew they had to go back into the ridges to kill more Japanese soldiers who were still trying to shell those very runways. The mission was a success, but the cost was still being tallied in the graveyards that were beginning to fill the southern end of the island. By late March, the Japanese spider's web was torn to shreds. The remaining defenders were pushed into a tiny pocket at the northern tip of the island called the Gorge. General Kuribayashi, realizing the end was near, sent a final telegram to Tokyo. The situation is now at its final stage. I apologize most humbly to His Majesty. He then ordered his men to destroy their colors and prepare for a final, coordinated strike. On the night of March 25th-26th, the silence was broken by a final, desperate act. Unlike the chaotic, screaming charges of earlier in the war, this was a disciplined, silent infiltration. Nearly 300 Japanese soldiers, including pilots and sailors whose units had been destroyed, crawled toward an American tent city near Airfield No. 2. Many of the Americans asleep in the tents were rear echelon troops, Seabees, pilots, and medics. The carnage was horrific. The Japanese moved through the tents with knives and grenades, killing men in their sleeping bags. It was a chaotic, hand-to-hand struggle in the dark. The Americans eventually rallied, led by the 5th Pioneer Battalion and African-American members of a shore party. By dawn, the last of the Japanese force had been eliminated. Over 250 Japanese lay dead. The Americans lost 53. General Kuribayashi was believed to have led this final charge himself. Some reports say he committed ritual suicide, seppuku, in a cave, while others say he died in the raid, having removed his badges of rank to fight as a common soldier. His body was never identified, a fitting end for a man who had become a ghost in the tunnels he created. With the end of the raid, the island was declared secure on March 26, 1945. But the word secure was a relative term. Thousands of Japanese remained in the tunnels, refusing to believe the battle was over. For months after the official end, mopping-up operations continued, and the sound of occasional gunfire still echoed through the sulfur vents of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. It was a small island, but the statistics of the struggle were staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, and nearly 20,000 were wounded. For the first time in the Pacific War, total American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner during the battle. The rest died in the caves or in the final raids. The bravery displayed on the island was unparalleled. 27 medals of honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than a quarter of all the medals awarded to Marines during the entire 4-year war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reflecting on the carnage, famously stated that among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. The battle became a defining moment for the United States Marine Corps. It proved that the American citizen soldier possessed a grit and determination that could overcome the most fortified defenses in the world. The image of the flag raising on Suribachi became more than just a photo. It became a symbol of national unity and the relentless pursuit of victory in the face of overwhelming odds. Iwo Jima also had a profound impact on the American home front. The casualty lists hit the newspapers with a devastating weight, bringing the reality of the war into living rooms across the country. It reinforced the belief that the Japanese would fight to the very last man for every inch of their soil, a realization that would eventually influence the decision to use the atomic bomb later that year. Today, the island of Iwo Jima, now called Iwo To, is a quiet place, returned to the Japanese government. It is a memorial, a place where veterans from both sides occasionally meet to remember the dead. The black sand is still there, and the smell of sulfur still hangs in the air, but the guns are silent. The uncommon valor of 1945 remains etched into the stone of the memorials and the history of a nation.
The Battle of Iwo Jima ended over 80 years ago, but its legacy remains as permanent as the granite of the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington. For the survivors, the island was a place they could never truly leave. The smell of sulfur and the feeling of the shifting ash lived in their dreams for decades. They were young men who went to a rock in the middle of nowhere to do an impossible job, and in doing so, they saved lives and changed the world. As the veterans of that greatest generation pass into history, the story of Iwo Jima serves as a stark reminder of the cost of freedom. It was a battle of attrition, a battle of tunnels, and a battle of icons. But above all, it was a battle of human spirit. The black sands of Iwo Jima remain a hallowed ground, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest hell, courage can rise like a flag against a stormy sky.